people be drifting in. This is our fourth and final session on the Reformation. Today we're going to talk about the Reformation as it affected England and Scotland, which is the reason why we're here as Presbyterians. So I heard something on the radio this week, I assume PBS. They were talking again about some push to reform the English language, because that's always one of the problems for people learning English. The spelling is so strange. Words that have all these silent letters and they're not spelled like they're pronounced and so forth. Somebody wants to, and then somebody else came on and said, "Well, that's great, except it depends who's doing the pronouncing. Are you Australian? Are you Scottish? Are you English? Are you American?" And that reminded me, this is what a 16th century Scotsman would have recognized as a very familiar name. That's how somebody in Scotland in the 16th century, speaking broad Scots, would have pronounced John Knox. That's John Knox. That's, if somebody said that, would be John Knox, not Ian Canucks, but John Knox. So that's the language that John Knox spoke, and he wrote in other languages, but that's what he spoke, especially when he gave his sermons. We'll talk about those here in a minute. So let's talk about John Knox. He again was a generation after Calvin, who was a generation after Luther. Luther, remember, put his theses up on the church door in 1517. Well, John Knox was all of 3 years old when that happened. So he was well going on before when he became. He got to be actually it's. There's an error here on the chronology. He didn't become a notary priest at the age of 10. That should be 1534. So he was smart, but he wasn't that smart. So then he goes to the University of St. Andrews. So he's an educated man, like Calvin, like some of the others we've talked about. He becomes his job is notary priest, and he's not ordained in the Catholic Church, which is what all they had when. But he filled in for priests in small rural churches that didn't have enough population or wherewithal to have a full-time priest. So he was aware of what's going on the continent. We know for a fact that when he was 14, he witnessed a public burning in Edinburgh of a Lutheran Scottish man named Patrick Hamilton, who was a Lutheran. So the Scots were still very much under the control of the Catholic Church at this point. Finally, the turning point in his life came in 1546. He was well known as a preacher and around Scotland, and so things kind of reached a head. The Catholic oppression. There was a cardinal by the name of Cardinal Beaton. He was the one who was responsible for the burning of Patrick Hamilton, and he did it again in 1546. Another, at this time, was George Wishart, who was a Calvinist. They burned him in Edinburgh. And so finally, Scotland, being kind of the rough and tumble place it was, 3 months later, Beaton got assassinated. And the rebels took refuge in Edinburgh Castle. Have you ever been to Edinburgh? You can't miss the castle. It's up on this, actually, it's, I think, a volcanic, old volcano or something on top of this. It dominates the entire town. They hold up in there. And so he became their chaplain. He wasn't involved with the assassination. John Knox wasn't or anything else, but they asked him to come in and help minister to their spiritual needs. So he said, okay, he did. Well, you probably should have thought that out a little better, because once you hold up your side of the castle, there's no way to get away. And so they were under siege. And a few months later, they had to surrender. And they surrendered to French troops. And you will think, what are the French doing in Scotland? Well, the Scottish had what they call the Old Alliance with the French, because they both didn't like the English. And so one or the other of them was always at odds with the English. And so if one of them had a war going on with the English, they would call on the other one for help. In this case, it was the French who were having problems with the English, so they called upon the Scottish. And the Scottish said, sure, we'll help you out. And they agreed to that deal by marrying the young girl, Mary, Queen of Scots, to the guy who was going to become king of France. And they were both just kids at this time. So they had French troops there in Scotland acting, kind of overlooking her regency. So they brought in French troops. They had to surrender. John Knox gets surrendered. He gets sentenced to being a galley slave. Again, this is the middle of 1500s. This is not Ben-Hur. This is not Romans. They had galley slaves, and that's what he was for the next 19 months. And he survived, barely. And then finally, the English and French worked things out, so there was a general amnesty, and he got released in 49. That was a turning point in his life because he spent the next 3 years of his life in England, helping them get the Reformation really going. We'll talk about that. We talk about Archbishop Cranmer. So he spent the next 3 years in England. Couldn't really go back to Scotland because Mary Tudor was still in power there. Then Mary Queen of Scots. But then in 1553, the King of England, Henry's son, Edward, dies. He's still a teenager. And his half-sister becomes queen, Mary Tudor. Now, Mary was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And like Catherine, Mary was a devout Catholic. So when she got in, things changed for the worse for the Protestants there in England. Knox got out in time. He beat it out of the country before the roundup got severe. And he goes to Geneva. Eventually ends up in Geneva. And who's in Geneva, of course, but John Calvin. And that's really what led Knox to become the spiritual leader that he was. He spent the next few years with Calvin. I like this part. I'll have to tell Helen about this. While Calvin was there, Knox was there in Geneva, he ministered to the English and Scottish exiles, sometimes preaching 3 times a week, and each sermon was 2 hours long. So how would you like to getting 6 hours worth of sermons done every week? I mean, if compared to that, half an hour or 30 minutes or 50 minutes seems like a snap. So while he was there, he also wrote a liturgy for use in Scotland, using again this broad Scots dialect. Nobody had ever written in Scots before. It wasn't considered to be really a language of literature or anything else. And it wasn't, and we're not talking about the Gaelic here. I'm not talking about Scots Gaelic. This is still a form of English, but the Scots used every day for everyday speech. So I have an example here, what it sounds like. This is when we watch a lot of shows on PBS, and there's somebody speaking Scottish. We always have to turn the closed captioning on because for the first 15, 20 minutes, I have no idea what they're saying. And they're speaking English, but they're speaking Scots English. So this is what it sounds like. This is not by John Knox. This is a poem by Robert Burns, written about 1800. And he imagines what it was like when Robert the Bruce talked to his men before the Battle of Bannockburn, when they beat the English and chased them out of England, or chased them out of Scotland. And so I'm sure my Scottish is very bad, but I've worked on this. But it sounds like this. Scots wha hae wi waddies bled, Scots wha Bruce often led. Welcome to your gory bed or to victory. Knows the day and knows the hour, see the frontal battle lure, see approach proud Edward's poor, chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave, wha can fill a coward's grave, wha say basis be a slave, let him turn and flee. Wha for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword will strongly draw, free man stand, a free man fall, let him stay with me. And that's what the broad Scots sounds like. So, and that's the language that John Knox preached in. Yeah, well, if you read it, you can actually pick it out. But to hear it pronounced, it's like, whoa. That's why you need closed captioning. So, I like this part too. I'd forgotten this, but I read this before, but I forgot it. When he was there in Geneva, so the situation back home was Mary was Queen of Scots, and Mary Tudor was the Queen of England. So Knox apparently had a problem with women in positions of power. And so he wrote this little pamphlet. It's not very much more than that. And it's entitled, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regime of Women. And John Calvin himself was no liberal, as we've seen. But even Calvin went to him and said, you don't want to do this. This is a bad idea. Really bad idea. But Knox did it anyhow. So, within a few months after that, Mary Tudor dies, and her half sister becomes queen. We know her as Queen Elizabeth I. She was a Protestant, but she also had read this pamphlet, and she never, ever forgave John Knox for writing it. So John Knox was from that point on persona non grata in England. He could not go to England, even to cross through to go to Scotland. So he burned his bridge on that one. And Knox tried to apologize and say, "Well, I didn't really mean it. It was taken out of context." But no, you really can't take something like the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous union out of women out of context. I mean, he said what he said. The reason he titled that was he intended to have other pamphlets, second blast, third blast, and Calvin said, "No, just don't let it. Stop digging. You're in a hole. Stop digging." And so that was the only one he ever did. Um, so Knox was a man who said what he thought, and sometimes it got him in trouble. And that really became clear a little later on. He finally goes back to Scotland in '59. Queen Mary is still a minor, but she's getting close to being an adult, which in Scotland counts as when she's you have to be 18. So um, there's Knox starts giving these sermons, talking about how the French really need to go home, and really Catholic churches are corrupt and Pope's Antichrist. But they're still in control. And there's this one fellow, this poor fellow, Walter Milne. He was 82 years old, and he was the last one to get burned in Scotland. And this was 1559. So this is well after everything's gone on in Germany. And they're still doing it in Scotland. So finally, by the next year, the French get kicked out. The English come and help the Scots kick the French out. And the Scottish Parliament calls on Knox and 5 other ministers to produce a statement of faith. And that's what we have in our book of confession now, as this, what we call it, known as the Scots Confession. It's the very first one after the very ancient ones. And it's 25 pages long. And they knocked it out in a week, which is really, of course, a lot of times this is what they had already written. All the sermons that John Knox gave, he probably just pieced them together. And so they came up with this Scots Confession. It was him and 5 other guys. But it was kind of like the Declaration of Independence. It was Thomas Jefferson and 4 other guys. And Thomas Jefferson does about, 98% of it. That's the way this one probably was with John Knox. The interesting thing was there were 5 other men who helped him do it. And their names were, see if you get a pattern here: John Douglas, John Rowe, John Spotswood, John Willock, John Winram. So it's a good thing they didn't have cell phones, because if somebody called and said, "Hey, it's for John," that would have been a problem. Because so 6 Johns. But Knox was the leader, and he put it together. And in Scotland, of course, they refer to the church as the Kirk. And you read the Scots Confession, it talks about how the Kirk does this, Kirk does that. You wonder, like, it's Star Trek, or what is it? No, it's not James T. Kirk. It's the Scottish Kirk. So it's they come up with that. Of course, Mary is still a Catholic, and so she doesn't sign off on it. But they say, never mind, forget it. We'll do it anyhow. So she's been out of the country because she did get married to the King of France, who was a young man who had all kinds of health problems. He dies at the age of 17, schizophrenia probably, most likely. So there she is, a widow, and the guy's brother becomes king, so he has no use for her. So she goes back. She's still Queen of Scotland, though. So she comes home to find John Knox and his bunch in control. But they let her, she's the queen, and they recognize that. But again, John Knox has problems keeping his mouth shut. And he gives these sermons. And we know for a fact, she calls him on the carpet at least 4 times after one of these sermons, in which he says something incendiary, and basically gives him a chance to explain away his words. And he does, grudgingly. But by the time the 4th time comes around, she says, "Okay, I've had it with you. This country's not big enough for you or me, so you need to go." So he does. He goes out in the countryside, doesn't leave the country. But he openly denounces her fitness to rule, which is the problem. But eventually, she does get married and has a son. And within just a few months after having the son, who was named James, she gets driven out. They keep the kid, who was raised by nannies and Protestant ministers, Presbyterian ministers his whole life. She gets driven out, ends up finally having to go to England, appeals to her cousin Elizabeth for sanctuary. Elizabeth claps her in jail for the next 15 years and finally executes her. So Mary has a very troubled life. But that's the end of Mary in Scotland. Knox, by this time, is not that old a man. He's only in his 50s. But the abuse he suffered on the galley as a galley slave has caught up with him. And so he dies in 72 after getting the church set up in Scotland. Scotland's firmly controlled by the Presbyterians at this point in time. And again, it's called Presbyterian because the Greek word for elder is presbyteros, and that's what it's a rule of each church is ruled by the elders. No bishops, no pope, just the elders. So he dies. His epitaph is still there in a church. It's St. Giles Church, and it says, "Here lies one man who feared God so much he never feared the face of any man." So he was very true to his beliefs to the very end. And let's see what else about him. He did not, as far as we know, translate a Bible. They used the William Tyndale Bible that had been out and around for a few decades. So that wasn't really, Knox wasn't really a scholar. He was more of a preacher, more of a popular kind of a guy to reach the people. So he wasn't going to sit down for months on end and translate something. Again, even though they spoke this broad Scots, they could read regular English, which is what they did. So, and then of course the reason there's so many Presbyterians in this country is that much later on there were other troubles in England and Scotland, and a lot of these Scots were exiled, coming here in the 18th century and settled down in Appalachia, down in that part of the country. So a lot of they're called Scots-Irish because they'd gone to Ireland first. King James settled a lot of Scots in Ireland, and they came from there. Actually, Ulster is still a remnant of that evidence, that effort. So a lot of the Scots came from Scotland and came from Ireland on top of that. So let's see what else. That's the story of John Knox. Again, he was in communication with John Calvin during this whole time. Also, the reformers in England. Again, Elizabeth did not like John Knox, but she was a Protestant and was willing to listen to what his ideas were, even if she didn't have any use for him personally. So, okay, that's Scotland. Now let's talk about England. Henry VIII. Everybody knows about Henry VIII. Trivia questions. How many wives did Henry VIII have? 6. Good. 6 wives. How many times did he get divorced? None. Because divorce was not allowed under the Catholic Church or under the church that he became the head of, which was basically Catholic Light, instead of the Pope who had Henry at the head. And so there really was no difference between the Catholic Church before and after, except the Pope wasn't there. Henry was. And Henry had to do that because, of course, divorce wasn't allowed under the Catholic Church. He had to get an annulment. And he just wasn't able to do that. And all the king's horses and all the king's men could not get the Pope to give an annulment to a marriage that had been there for 20-some years and had nothing defective on its face at all, except he wanted to marry somebody younger and prettier. And so he eventually said, okay, heck with you. I'm now the head of the church. I declare myself annulled. I declare the marriage annulled. So Catherine, see you. And then he became the head of the church. And that remains the case to this day in United Kingdom, the monarch is the head of the what's now known as the Anglican Church. That caused a problem later on, of course, because what happens if you have a Catholic become monarch? How do you have a Catholic in charge of the Anglican Church? Well, that didn't work, and so they tried that once and it didn't work, and so there's a law that says you can't be Catholic. You're going to be the King of England, the Queen of England. You can't be Catholic. There aren't many rules. That's one of them. So anyhow, Henry gets that taken care of, and the church remains pretty much the same. There are some casualties along the way. Thomas More, we talked about him. He was Henry's chancellor. He didn't have any problem burning Lutherans, which he did, even before Henry declared himself to be the head of the church. Once Henry did that, though, More somehow found his principles and said, I can't go sign off on that. Just let me retire quietly to the country, and I won't say anything. Well, with Henry's, that wasn't a possibility. So he was either his way or the highway. So Knox ends up getting beheaded, or More gets getting beheaded, along with, unfortunately, the young woman he marries as wife number 2, Anne Boleyn, when she fails to give him a male heir, which is what he really, really, really wants, a male heir. She gives him a daughter who will reign as Elizabeth. That's Anne Boleyn's daughter, but no sons. So Henry always had a wandering eye, and so his eye wandered to another woman. But of course, with divorce not possible, and you just couldn't keep doing these annulments, that just looked silly. But if you were a widower, then you could get married again. So Anne gets convicted of treason, sentences death, off her head comes. So he gets married again and has a son, but his wife dies in childbirth. So shoot. So now wife number 4, and it gets confused here on out. He gets one more annulment and another beheading, and finally wife number 6 survives him. Why she married him in the first place? Wife number 6, the odds are not good. I mean, not good. But she rolled the dice and she came out on top. He died before she did. So, but that's the the church in England through the 1530s and 1540s really was still very much the Catholic Church. It had not really changed. Even though there was all this Reformation going on in England or Scotland and Germany and Switzerland, it hadn't changed in England at all. But then Henry finally dies, and his young son Edward becomes king. And Edward's just a teenager, but he has a very strong leader in Archbishop Cranmer, Thomas Cranmer, and he's the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so he sets forth in reforming the church along some Calvinists, some Lutheran, but it's an Anglican church, kind of unique under its own. In that takes place, if you've ever been to an Anglican prayer or Episcopalian in this country, they have a Book of Common Prayer. Cranmer wrote that. It's still pretty much used, intact. The services, Cranmer didn't mind the superficial trappings of the Catholic Church. So they still wore robes. They still had the altar on the east side of the church. You still come in and you'd bow to the altar, kneel during communion. The outward trappings were the same, but the underlying it was a Protestant church. And some people wanted to do away with that. We'll talk about them in a couple of minutes, but that's the way the church was, say, by 1550. It was, and then Calvin had his people had come over, and then Knox. That's why Knox showed up for several years. He was helping get them reformed as well. But then again, Edward dies, and who becomes queen? Mary. Mary is militant Catholic, and it's either her way or the highway. And some of the guys, like Cranmer, don't get out of town fast enough. So she's only queen for 3 years. It's estimated during that time there were about 300 people that got burned. So that's why she's known as Bloody Mary. She did not invent the drink, as far as we know. But she's known as Bloody Mary. Her husband, by the way, is the King of Spain. You have the King of Spain married to the Queen of England. They did not have any kids. She dies after 3 years, probably of ovarian cancer, what we can tell from the medical records. So she dies without leaving an heir. except her half-sister, who is Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth becomes queen and rules in great glory for 40-some years. And by that time, the English church is firmly established as an Anglican church. And they use the Tyndale Bible. Remember William Tyndale? We talked about him a couple weeks ago. There's a piece in here about his work. He translated the Bible back in the 1520s, in the 1530s, but he had to do it outside the country because Henry, again, was still very much on the Catholic path by that time. And Tyndale, they finally catch up with him, and he gets burned. But he completes the translation of the Bible. And that's one of the reasons that the King James Bible, when they come along and do it, they're able to knock that out so fast because they take about 90% of what Tyndale's already done and just put a different cover on it and say, hey, it's now the King James Bible. So they changed it some, but not a whole lot. So so they've got the Bible and they got the Book of Common Prayer. But now there's a movement in England during this time. Some people want to purify the church. They want to purify the church by getting rid of some of this Catholic trappings, and they are known as Puritans. And so they don't. Elizabeth puts up with them, but they don't get a whole lot of traction while she's there because she wants to be. She's a moderate Protestant. The Puritans want to get rid of the bishops. They want to. They still sign with the cross. They bow to the altar. So it looks on the surface Catholic, but it's really not. But they want to get rid of all that and have a purified church, much like the Presbyterians are in Scotland. Because again, John Knox, he's gotten rid of all that stuff. There's no more kneeling for communion. There's no more ministers don't wear. They wear a black robe. That's it. No surplice, no hat, mitre. So yeah, that's the state of the church in England for some 40-some years. And then Elizabeth never marries. So she has no children. And her nearest heir is, you have to go back to the fact that Mary, Queen of Scots, was her first cousin. Now, Mary had a son, you recall, James. So he was basically Elizabeth's first cousin once removed. And he was the nearest thing they had to an heir. So when Elizabeth dies, James becomes king not only of Scotland, but also of England. He's King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England. He's lived his whole life in Scotland. He doesn't know anything about England at all. And so it's a rude surprise when he comes down and finds all these Englishmen who have their own ideas about things. He does not get along with them very well at all. And they have a meeting within the first few months of him getting there, and he has it out with the Puritans. And finally, he just stands up and says, okay, no bishop, no king. And that's it. Because he sees that as an attack on his authority. And he's very proud of his authority. And he's not going to let anybody touch it. So he does authorize a new version of the Bible to be written. And it takes about a year and a half for him to knock it out. And that's now known as the King James Bible. Again, James was raised his whole life by Presbyterians. But he's not really Presbyterian. And as soon as he gets out of Scotland, he has no intention of ever going back. And the last thing he wants to do is be subject to these Presbyterian ministers who are heckling him all the time, hectoring him, telling him what to do. So that's the state of the church in England by the year 1603, 1604. Let's see. There's I included a cover sheet in here. That's what the Tyndale Bible looked like. Incredibly ornate drawing. And they weren't above sucking up to the king because of all the little cartoon balloons down below. Everybody's saying, Vivat Rex, which means long live the king. Trying to appeal to Henry. It didn't work, but they tried anyhow. But this was the 1539 version of the Tyndale Bible. Probably published in, I would imagine, probably the Netherlands. The Tyndale. Yeah, William Tyndale. He did his in the 1520s and 30s. This was printed in 1539. That's the front page. But you can imagine, I mean, think how long it took to draw that. That's a pen and ink drawing. Yeah, sure. So, but again, this is not something everybody was going to buy for their home use. They were just too expensive. Even when they were printed, they're about this thick, and it would cost a lot of money to buy one. Okay, let's see what else we got. Now, if you read the Scots Confession, like a lot of these older confessions, there's stuff in there that the PCUSA does not endorse today. A lot of language about how the Pope is bad and the Mass is evil and that sort of thing. They really don't do that, push that anymore. But at the time, that's what they thought. So, and again, in the Presbyterian Church, as in the other Protestant churches, baptism and communion, those are the only two sacraments. They've done away with all the other ones that the Catholics had. So, all right. Lastly, I've got this little drawing here. This shows what the Christianity was in Europe in 1600. This isn't quite right. The Protestants are the ones with their hands raised up. There should be somebody. It should be a Protestant in Switzerland, of course, and there's not. And there should be at least a couple, three in France. Still majority Catholic, by the way. But it gives you an idea that even by 1600, probably 75 or 80% of Europe was still Catholic. Protestants were there, but they weren't dominant by any means. And since by 1600, the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese all had various chunks of the New World, they were busy making converts over there too, one way or the other, by force or otherwise. And so the number of Catholics in the world was still expanding, even though they'd lost Northern Europe. So, okay, the Catholics are the ones that are standing there with their hands down their sides. The Protestants have their one hand upraised. The Orthodox Church over down in the southeast part of Europe and over in Russia, they're the ones with the long robes. That's the Orthodox Christian Church. They're still there, even though the Turks and Mongols have taken over a lot of their territory. And then, of course, the Arab Islam. Islam has the ones down in Turkey and across North Africa. So that's where Islam is concentrated. There weren't a whole lot of them down there, as you see, except maybe in Egypt and what's now Turkey. And southeastern Europe was still Christian, but it was Christian dominated it was ruled by the Turks. The Ottoman Turks had taken it over. So, Protestants. And there should be again. This map is not perfect. There should be a Protestant in Switzerland. Switzerland is about half and half, and there should be some in France, but there's not. So that's but you see the Protestants they're in what's now the Netherlands, Northern Germany, Scandinavia, England, Scotland, Hungary, but the rest of Europe is still Catholic, and that is pretty much the way it would stay. It hasn't changed that much. And I should say, I don't want to leave you with the idea that the Catholic Church was just oblivious to all of what was going on. They had something called the Counter-Reformation go on during the 16th century, in which they got rid of indulgences, for example. They cleaned up their act as far as the popes having kids. They did away with a lot of the more blatant abuses, um, but by that it was too late to get the Protestants to come back, because they still had the Pope at the head of the church, and that was never going to fly with the Protestants. So, but they got rid of a lot of and they also concentrated more on education. The great teaching order of the Jesuits started in the 16th century. They started universities reaching out, missionaries, evangelism. So the Catholic Church was not the same in 1600 as it was in 1500. They changed a lot during that 100-year period, in response to what was going on with the Protestants. Okay, let's see, anything else? Mm-hmm. Oh, also let you know what a fellow Henry VIII was. Um, he didn't do he wanted to get married, of course, again, but he also wasn't above putting money in his pocket at the same time. Across England during this time, there were dozens of monasteries, and they owned a lot of land. Had loaned it for years. People would give the monastery the land when they died as part of their will, and so they didn't pay taxes. Well, of course, the monasteries were all Catholic monasteries, and so when Henry came along and said, "Hey, I'm now the head of the church," monasteries said, "We can't buy off on that." And so Henry said, "Okay, fine, you're dissolved. I get all your stuff." And so across England now there are dozens of former monasteries, mostly ruins, because they came in and took all their property and let the monastery fall into ruin. Um, but that's he he was not the altruistic fellow. I think he is actually he was something of a sociopath, but um, let's see what else. That's all I've got. So